Plant Physiology Part 3. In this presentation, we're going to look at how plants take in nutrients. We've already looked at how plants take in water and transport water all around the plant, and we've also looked at how plants make food and then transport food when it's made all around the plant in the phloem. We're now looking at how plants take in nutrients. So what we're thinking about here, and it's quite important agriculturally, is how plants take in their calcium, how they take in their magnesium, how they take in their nitrogen through their roots. All right, so we're starting here with what's called a transverse section of a root. And what I mean by a transverse section is if you picture a carrot and you chop up your carrot to make some stew. So you're cutting straight across the carrot. Well, we're cutting straight across a root here. And this is what it would look like. Now, this particular root is called a dicot root. And dicot means that when this particular plant was a seed, it had two little food stores called cotyledons in the seed. And then when this plant would grow, those cotyledons generally turn into the first two seed leaves of the plant. And plants can be divided up into two overall groups, one called monocots and the other called dicots. And they have certain traits depending on whether they were monocots, meaning they had only one of those food stores in their seed, or dicots, meaning they had two of those food stores in their seeds. But there'll be more coming up on that in the next chapter, which is called plant classification. For now, all you need to know is that this is what you would see if you were to cut across a plant root, and then you were to cut a very thin section of that plant root and put it under a microscope. Okay. So let's start on the outside to look at the structure of this root, and then when we're finished talking about the structure, we'll talk about how it actually absorbs nutrients. So on the outside of, we have a layer called the epidermis, and you'll remember that from when we did the structure of the leaf. It was also covered in a layer called the epidermis. In fact, we're covered in a layer called the epidermis, and it's quite a frequent name used for the outside layer of any particular structure. So there's our epidermis, the green layer going around there. Right inside that epidermis then, you have some tissue called the cortex, or sometimes it's known as the ground tissue. And that's kind of filling the gap here between the epidermis and then your inner layer. Now, let's just skip this little bit here and go right into the inside of the root. And right in the inside of the root, you can see this kind of an X-shaped or cross-shaped xylem. And you'll remember that from when we were talking about water transport in the plant, because we know that the water has to come in through the root. It comes in through this root hair here, through the cortex, through this other little layer and into the xylem. And then in the xylem, the water travels all around the plant. Now, then we need to look at the phloem here, and the phloem we mentioned already as well. So when we were talking about photosynthesis, we said photosynthesis makes food for the plant, and that food travels all around the plant in your phloem. And the roots are no different. If the roots are going to get energy for growth, then they're going to have to use some of those little sugars that are floating around in the phloem. Right, so now just to get back to this little layer here, the layer in between the cortex and the inner layer, and that is called the endoderm. And endo often means inside. So this is the inside layer, if you like, of the root. And you'll see it has a thing called the Casparian strip. Now, the Casparian strip is quite a specialized barrier in plants. So it does a few things. It protects the plants from microorganisms that might be coming in dissolved in the water. So if you picture the water, it's come in through the root hair, it's going here through the cortex, and you don't really want those microorganisms getting any further because they could carry disease all around the plant. So it acts as a kind of a filter to block out those microorganisms, but also it makes sure that the water flows just in one direction. So it kind of funnels that water into the xylem here, funnels the water into the xylem. It doesn't allow the water to either flow from one cell to another and just kind of flood around this endoderm, or indeed to come back out and just go out again through the root hairs. So it keeps that water flowing in one direction, and in that way it is said to regulate the uptake of the water. And the minerals then, or the nutrients, are actually dissolved in the water. So the pathway of the water, in effect, is the pathway of those mineral nutrients. So when we talk about how do we get the calcium into the plant, or the magnesium into the plant, or the nitrates into the plant from the soil, well, they actually travel in with the water through the root hairs, through this cortex, and into the xylem. Okay, so if you remember, when we looked at the leaf, we talked about how the leaf was adapted for its function. And how is the root adapted for its function? Well, those root hairs are the main adaptation of the root. The root hairs are tiny little projections coming off the side of each root, and they increase the surface area for the absorption of water and nutrients from the soil. So they give it a much bigger surface area than it would otherwise have. If you can picture, if you didn't have this little projection, you would have this bit of area and this bit of area and this bit of area. But now you have other ways that the water can go in. It can go in here from the sides, or here from the sides, or there along the end as well. So it's increasing the surface area for absorbing the water. So the nutrients then go in through the root hairs with the water. And this all happens by a process called active transport. Now, we need to spend a little time looking at what is active transport. And I'm going to do that by kind of contrasting it with the process that we talked about when we were looking at water going into the plant. And that process was called osmosis. And we did a definition of osmosis. We said that it was the movement of water from an area of high water concentration, so a place where there's loads of water, to an area of low water concentration across a semi-permeable membrane, like the cell membranes of all those little cells inside in the plant. We also said that that process didn't require energy, because it's quite easy for water to go from a place where there's loads of water to an area where there's less water. So it happens quite naturally. And the technical term for that is that it's a passive process, meaning it'll happen naturally. You don't have to use energy to make it happen. And our example of that was the water entering the roots. Now, though, what about the nutrients? Well, the nutrients go into the roots by a process called active transport. And there's a clue in the name straight away. And we might as well look at how that's different to osmosis. It's an active process, meaning it needs energy to happen. Now, why does it need energy to happen? Well, active transport is the name given to a process where any substance moves. So we had water for osmosis, so this is the movement of any substance from an area of low concentration of that substance to an area of high concentration, so the exact opposite of what we had in osmosis. So if we think here about our calcium and our magnesium and our nitrates, say, dissolved in the soil water out around the roots, if you think of all the water, the soil water that's out there, and then the very relatively small amounts of calcium and magnesium that we're talking about. So there isn't that much calcium and magnesium. It's not that concentrated. There's a lot more water. So that's described as an area of low concentration for those calcium and magnesium. And they're moving into the roots that have probably already absorbed quite a lot of calcium, quite a lot of magnesium, quite a lot of nitrate. And so they're going into an area of high concentration. Again, the exact opposite. So if you think about it, they're going against the concentration gradient. And that's going to require energy. And that's why it's called an active process. You need energy in order to do that. Just one little thing that both of those definitions have in common. Again, it's across a semi-permeable membrane, meaning these nutrients are passing through the cell membrane. So they're going from cell to cell. They're going across a semi-permeable membrane. So again, that's osmosis versus active transport, two important definitions in this chapter. And when you think osmosis, you should think, oh, that's the water and it's going downhill. It's going from a place where there's loads of water to an area where there's less water, and that doesn't require energy. And then when you think of active transport, you should be thinking of forcing something against the gradient. So you're forcing in nutrients into the roots where there's already a fair amount of nutrients. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by using energy to kind of pump them in against that concentration gradient. Right. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Casparian strip. So here's a nice picture of Again, it's a transverse section of a root, so it's cutting right across the root. And you can see the little root hairs coming off that root. And you can see this has been treated nicely with some stain. So you can see the lovely ground tissue, or cortex as it's called here. And then you can see our endoderm with Casparian strips here. Okay, and then you can see your xylem and your phloem on the inside. So just to revisit, what exactly does that Casparian strip do? It's an important barrier that regulates the uptake of water and nutrients. Now, what I mean by that is it controls the water and nutrients, the passage of the water and the nutrients. So once they've come in through the root hairs, through the ground tissue here, you don't want them just turning around, wasting their time, just traveling in the wrong directions around this ground tissue or cortex, or maybe back out through the root hairs. You want to make sure they get funneled in here into the xylem. So that in that way, the Casparian strip acts like a funnel, if you like, to funnel the water in. It stops the nutrients leaking back into the soil, and it also protects the plant against microorganisms. So it's effectively a barrier against the microorganisms as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about in this chapter is a particular group of plants that have a very lucky symbiotic relationship with some bacteria. So that group of plants used to be called the leguminosae, or the legumes is our common word for them, and it would include peas, beans, and lentils. And those lucky leguminosae, or now they're called Fabaceae in the new naming system. Not sure why they had to change, but anyway, have little bacteria living in nodules on their roots. So you can imagine this is the root here of a pea plant, and it has these little nodules on the roots. And in those nodules, you have bacteria living in there. And those bacteria have a symbiotic relationship with the plant. Now, what does a symbiotic relationship mean? It means effectively I scratch your back and you scratch mine. So I'm getting a benefit and you're getting a benefit. So the more technical definition would be two organisms from different species. So in this case, we have bacteria, and we have legume plants like peas, beans, lentils, clover. They're living in close proximity with benefit involved. Okay, so let's look at the benefit here. So what do these little bacteria do for the plant? Well, those bacteria actually take nitrogen from the soil and they change it into nitrate, which is a chemically active form of the nitrogen that the plants can actually use. So you may have come across the word nitrate before. Any of you that would have seen fertilizer spread at home might have been using calcium ammonium nitrate, which is a straight nitrogen fertilizer. And it gives a very good, quick growth response. Say if you're spreading CAN for the grass growth, you'll see a very quick grass growth after you have spread your calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Would have been one of the more popular nitrogen fertilizers in Ireland for years and years. And the reason is because the nitrogen is in that form of nitrate that can be used straight away by the plant. It can be absorbed and used straight away by the plant. Whereas if we were spreading the likes of urea, urea also has nitrogen in it. And again, it's another reasonably popular straight nitrogen fertilizer in Ireland. But when you spread urea, the nitrogen in the urea has to be, first of all, converted into nitrate before it can be used by the plant for making protein and for allowing the plant to grow. Now, what is the implication of that? Well, if you spread urea, you get a much slower growth response. So it won't kick in. You won't see the grass growth for a little while after the urea. Also, some of the urea will volatilize, which means it'll turn into nitrogen gases, maybe ammonia gas, and it'll be lost off the field before it gives any growth response. So that's what those little bacteria do in the roots of your legumes. They convert nitrogen into nitrate, which is a chemically active form of nitrogen that can be used by the plant, which is great. Now, what do they get out of the relationship? Well, they actually get, I suppose, a place to live, first of all, but also in that place that they're living, they have access to sugars from the plant. So they can get access to sugars from the plant's phloem, and that is their source of nutrition. So that's why it's an example of symbiosis. The rhizobium give fixed nitrogen, or what that means is they change the nitrogen into nitrate for the plant, and then the rhizobium get their own sugars as a food source. This would be why you'd often see nowadays when you get a seed mix, if you're reseeding fields, there'd be a percentage of clover in your seed, your grass seed. And clover is a member of this family, the Leguminosae, and it has rhizobium living on its roots. And so the rhizobium will help to convert any nitrogen in the soil into nitrates and give a quick growth response from spreading any fertilizer as well. Okay, that brings us to the end of the plant physiology chapter. So thank you for listening.